Thank you all. It's a true pleasure to be here this afternoon. I'm going to speak for about a half hour, maybe 40 minutes, and then I'd like to take your questions. But I think I'll start off by answering the one question that everybody always asks, which is, how does a guy who is not Jewish and who can't play a lick of violin come to write a book about violins during the Holocaust? And the answer to that is that I'm a professor of music at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. And my institution in 2012 had the pleasure of bringing 18 of these violins to our city. It was the first time that the Violins of Hope had appeared anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. And as with these types of community partnerships, it was several years in the making, bringing these instruments to Charlotte. And while I wasn't a member of the team that was working towards that, as a member of that faculty, as a musician, and as a historian, I was really fascinated by the stories I was hearing about these violins. So in February of 2011, I took a trip out to Israel, to Tel Aviv, to meet with Amnon Weinstein. He's the Israeli violin maker who, for the past almost 25 years now, has been collecting and restoring these instruments. I spent about a week with Amnon in his workshop, listening to his story, seeing the violins for myself, holding them in my hands. And it was during that trip that I became inspired to write this book about the Violins of Hope. And I'll have to admit that at first, I wasn't quite sure how I was going to write this book. I knew I really, really wanted to do it. But what I had was a collection of stories about individual violins. And while they are wonderful and inspirational stories, it wasn't clear to me at first how they all tied together to make a book. And near the end of my first visit to Tel Aviv, it finally dawned on me that Amnon himself is the thread that holds these instruments together. It's his story that brings the book together, and it's his story I'd like to share a little bit with you this afternoon. So Amnon's earliest memories are of sitting around the family table at major holidays like Passover and Rosh Hashanah in the late 1940s in their home in Tel Aviv. There were 4 of them: Amnon, his little sister Esther, and their parents, Moshe and Golda Weinstein. And 400 ghosts. These were the ghosts of the relatives whom Moshe and Golda had left behind when they had immigrated in 1938 from Eastern Europe to Palestine, eventually finding their way to Tel Aviv, where Moshe opened up a shop where he repaired and sold violins. When they first moved to Palestine, they received a few letters from some of the family members they had left behind, asking for help with securing visas. But after Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941, all communication was cut off. They heard nothing from their family. They heard nothing of their family. It wasn't until after the war, when a survivor of the Holocaust visited Moshe Weinstein in his Tel Aviv home, that he learned the horrifying truth, which was that his family and Golda's family, 400 people in all, had all been murdered in the Holocaust. The pain of this discovery was too much for Moshe to bear. He had a heart attack that evening. He survived that particular heart attack, but eventually that would take his life. From that point on, he refused to ever speak of his family again. Golda was also too grief-stricken to talk about her family. When young Amnon would ask, "Where are my grandparents? Where are my uncles, my aunts? Where are my cousins?" She struggled to find the answer to that question. The best she could do was take out a book she had found about the Holocaust, and she would point to the ghastly photos of the dead and say, "This is where your grandparents are. This is our family." She would break down in tears, unable to explain further. So although Moshe and Golda were too grief-stricken to talk about their lost family members, their grief and sorrow permeated the Weinstein household. and with it, Amnon's childhood. Moshe was the president of an immigrants association, and the Weinstein home was often the first stop for survivors from the Holocaust who'd come to try to start a new life in the land of their biblical ancestors. Moshe welcomed them all for homemade meals and warm beds until they could find homes of their own. As a young boy, Amnon was frightened by these emaciated strangers who were startled by every noise. He couldn't understand why they hid leftover bread under their pillows at night. Years passed until the sounds of them crying themselves to sleep stopped resonating in Amnon's own nightmares. As a young man, Amnon tried to forget about this unimaginable tragedy that had robbed him of his extended family and replaced them with these terrifying strangers. He busied himself by establishing a career as a luthier, a maker and repairer of string instruments, apprenticing first with his father in the Weinstein shop in Tel Aviv, and then moving to Cremona, Italy, to study old world craftsmanship in the town that gave us some of the best dynasties in violin making, Amati, Guarneri, Stradivarius. When Moshe passed away in 1986, Amnon took over the family shop. And although he continued to try to ignore the Holocaust, it continued to haunt him. A few years after Moshe died, a survivor from Auschwitz visited Amnon in the workshop in Tel Aviv. He brought with him a violin that he had played in Auschwitz, but which he hadn't touched since being liberated from the death camp. Now he wanted to get the violin repaired in the hopes that his grandson would start playing. Amnon looked at the instrument and noted damage to the top of the instrument that had come from being played outside in the rain and the snow in Auschwitz. When he opened up the instrument to make repairs, he discovered inside ashes. Ashes that he could only presume to be fallout from the crematoria at Auschwitz. The very thought of what this violin and its owner had been through together shook Amnon to his very core. But again, he pushed these gruesome thoughts aside. He still wasn't quite ready to confront the Holocaust. It wasn't until the 1990s when Amnon started to train his own son, Avshalom, how to make and repair violins, that Amnon was finally ready to reclaim his lost heritage. He started thinking about the role that music, specifically the violin, played in Jewish lives during the Holocaust. He started locating and restoring violins that were played by Jews in concentration camps and ghettos, painstakingly piecing them back together so they can come alive again on the concert stage. Although so many musicians who once played these neglected and severely damaged instruments were silenced by the Holocaust, their voices and spirits live on through the violins that Amnon has lovingly restored. He calls these instruments the violins of hope.